The words political economy give a boring, dry, academic sense to a subject that really touches all of our lives. My take on political economy is based on how created wealth should be distributed. Barely any so-called academic economist will disagree with one another about how wealth is actually created. The real disagreement is born when folk discuss how they believe wealth should be distributed. Land, labour and capital were the classical factors of production. The classical economists, one thinks of Adam Smith, David Ricardo and others, described how land, labour and capital work together. For those who supply land, rent was due. For those who supplied labour, wages were due. And for those who provided capital, returns on capital or interest were due. Now, there are, in my opinion, two major inequities, injustices in economics. One, and the major reason, derives from the monopoly of land by private individuals. The great American economist and writer Henry George in 1879 wrote Progress and Poverty. He observed that progress would often go hand in hand with poverty. Henry George's prognosis was that in order to remedy the private monopoly of land, a land value tax to 100% should be placed on those who own land. I'll say a little more about that later on. In terms of capital, the definition of capital can be a very vexatious one. Capital classically was the likes of machinery and other physical devices to aid labour working on land to produce wealth. I say capital is a vexatious term because in considering capital we have to consider money as well. More on that a little later. Suffice to say that along with the major injustice of the monopoly of land, one needs to add the private monopoly on the creation of money, which should be by the people or delegated to the government by the people for the benefit of the people, and not for the profit of private bankers, which happens at the moment. My primary conceit in writing this book is to highlight these two injustices together: private monopoly of land and the private monopoly of the creation of money. Unlike the more exact sciences, political economy is tainted or influenced by human desire. The most natural thing in the world is for human beings to want the most they can gather to themselves for the least effort. And if the least effort requires telling lies that can become institutionalized and embodied in law, then the whole subject of how wealth is created and questions of distribution arise becomes quite troublesome. So looking through the start of my book, noting that the front cover is a Turner painting of Dudley, Worcestershire, and as I live in Smethwick, Dudley's fairly close and represents the Black Country area of the Midlands, England. This is an e-book at the moment. The future might see a printed version. I would have done a printed version alongside the Kindle. Unfortunately, the book is too long to be an Amazon print on demand. So I'm looking into independently having this printed. Chapter 1 I've called Henry George's Legacy, and I've summarised Henry George's work, where he concludes the justice form of taxation is the land value tax. Now, Henry George himself, and indeed those who followed in his footsteps, who one may call neo-Georgists, have not tackled the subject of money. This is a long chapter in my Kindle book, and one has to say that money is a very complex subject that I don't believe few people agree on. So my intention is to observe the history of money somewhat and give my own opinion of it. and allow the reader to form their own opinion as well. Suffice to say, the possible key section of chapter 2 is how banks create money, and I've drawn extensively on the work of Joseph Huber, who has written on the subject of sovereign money. It's a very informative source of information. Going on to chapter 3, from inequity to equity, I go through various themes. Thomas Malthus refuted. I describe not only inequity but alienation. There are different forms of alienation that human beings have undergone. I've discussed what I call the twin serpents of land and capital. These are the two sources of injustice, if you will. And I've gone through these various themes here. And I've made an argument based on the work of these monetary reformers such as Huber, Irving Fisher and Clifford U. Douglas, that it would be possible to conceive of a universal basic income for people. One of the basic flaws in much egalitarian thinking of political economy is that for poorer people, wages should only be the sole source of income. The problem with that is other sources of income, such as returns on capital, and I think especially returns on the ownership of land, form a larger part of productive value. And this returns back to the Henry George, of course, where his notion of a land value tax would bring all that privately owned wealth into the Commonwealth, and from that Commonwealth a universal basic income could be distributed, and allowing people to engage in meaningful work. And you know, if I could give an example, when people work at a checkout in a supermarket, one might feel that because there are automated checkouts that you scan, that by using the scanners you are depriving people of a wage, because checkout cashiers were made redundant. This is the incorrect way of looking at things, because this assumes that their only source of income should be a wage. Now, if, for example, a supermarket, the big supermarket chains were hit with land value taxes, then that money would go to the Commonwealth, and any laid off cashiers would be afforded an income, universal basic income from the Commonwealth. So yeah, that's a simplified version of the argument. Now, going on to lies and obfuscations. Lies, if you recall, was the fourth element of the book's title. And lies come in all sorts. People want to lie about their ownership of land. A big thing is the conflation of land with capital. Thinkers like Karl Marx and people on the other side of the spectrum have conflated land with capital. They've joined land with capital and they haven't differentiated from it. The scheming of banking, this is politics. The babushka ownership dolls, this is the Russian dolls where one company is owned by another company, which is owned by another company, and you can never go find out who owns it. Likewise, following the money trail discusses how one can look for causality in the world of politics and economics by following where the money is, but that's not always easy. Mathematical browbeating, this is where people who are clever, quote unquote, are paraded and who browbeat us with their cleverness. Just going on, chapter 5 discusses the history of England and Britain up until more modern times. Progress amid poverty in Great Britain looks at the constituent countries. Ireland, of course, was once part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. We look at those we can't criticise. We look at the School of Economic Science, where I first came across the ideas of Henry George, and we look how, despite Henry George knowing a complete victory, we've seen elements of land value tax to some extent within fiscal policy. In chapter 7, Ptolemaic economics seeks to describe how, for me, that by ignoring the central message of Henry George, we have a Ptolemaic, an earth-centred view of the universe in terms of economics, where we've got useful idiots on the left and the right, the communists, the Austrians, John Maynard Keynes call that Emperor Keynes woolly new clothes, because I just think it was BS what he came up with. I've read Keynes' major work twice, and to me it's just bullshit. So the international money traders, this is about bankers. I didn't want to dignify bankers by actually calling them bankers, because they're money traders. They wear suits and they go to posh schools in Oxford and Cambridge and so on and so forth, but at the end of the day they're just barrow boys, and it's from the ranks of the international money traders that the nation state is compromised for those who want to move money around the world to elect for their own policies by pulling the strings of politicians. Now, chapter 9 on globalisation. This is the longest chapter in the book, and I've looked at various nations, not all nations, but particular nations. I've examined questions of land, labour, capital and trade immigration and war. And one of the great revelations of my 8 years of research was the origins of World War I and World War II. And I'll give out a mention to Guido Preparata, who was an established economist but fell foul of establishment academia, and he argued a powerful case that National Socialist Germany was built up on purpose in order for it to self-destruct and allow for a subsequent Anglo-American hegemony in Europe. And I think in time people are going to realise that as in the case of Henry George's central message, this historical message is going to take a long time for the penny to drop for most people. I look at Tweedledee and Tweedledum in Britain. This is the sort of Labour conservative dialectic. Gold and the petrodollar. I look at informal empire. I look again at those people we can't criticise, and these other countries, and money and drugs. In chapter 10, this is from global perfidy to local corruption. I look at a leading family of bankers who one is not allowed to criticise. Look at the lie of man-made global warming, looking at agendas 21 and 30, and going from global to local. I look at regional local government in Britain and England specifically. I look at my own borough of Sandwell, where I was once an elected councillor, and corruption involved there. Now, in chapter 11, that's called the 2020 Scandemic, I was both grateful for this from a writer's perspective, but also sad from being a member of the public's perspective. I thought the 2020 Scandemic showed how stupid most people are. Yeah, I confess I'm something of an intellectual snob, and that's just the way I am. We look at the way people had pointed objects injected into them without questioning it, and I tie this in with questions of mortality and pensions and longevity. The last chapter of the book is the religious mind space, where I look at the big three religions. I look at the one that one can't criticise, look at Christianity, and I look at Islam. And I look at the notion of statism and anarchism and other philosophies. In Appendix A, I look over UK columns, very informative Dissident's Guide to the Constitution, which I found very useful from the point of view of understanding the politics. I don't fall in line with their Austrian economics, but nevertheless, I believe my critique of this series of lectures from UK column is interesting. I look at The Economist, who owns it, and various details of that. And in Appendix C, I give a short autobiography where I describe my own personal journey, and the reader might wonder as to why I feel I can write this. Well, I've described the philosophical premise for this in terms of remedying the injustices of private land monopoly and the injustices of private money creation. I would say my three major credentials are the fact that for the last 8 years, I've studied and made notes on a couple of hundred books. That's the origin of my initial interest was the School of Economic Science, School of Philosophy, now that introduced me to Henry George's work. I was in politics for a short while, local politics. In 2004, I was sacked from my job for standing for the British National Party in the European elections. I subsequently was elected in the council elections in Sandwell in 2006. I have a first-hand experience of politics, albeit it was a fairly short career. I resigned from the BNP in 2007, but carried on as an independent councillor for another few years. I expect quite a few of the current Reform councillors will resign from the party and carry in the same way. So I have first-hand political experience, and this political experience, it cannot be gainsaid. When you are experienced to politics firsthand, people know that there are a lot of lies in politics, but they don't understand the extent to which political figures and political parties are steered by outside forces. For most people, politics is about people with microphones and wearing suits on television. They don't understand the inner landscape, and this is something that's difficult to teach. You have to understand it from the inside. And lastly, I have to say that I've worked hard on this book. It is genuine. It's not an easy subject. In many ways, it requires a little bit of effort. I'm not a clever person, but I'm very determined. I've been something like a bulldog with this subject, and I finally brought it to fruition when I published on the 21st of March 2026. So I invite the reader to consider what I've written, and by all means, please get in touch and tell me of your own opinions. I regard myself, along with the reader, as a fellow pilgrim, and my intention has not been to lecture from a pulpit, but give a very considered view from which I'm certainly amenable to changing if I see I'm in the wrong. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll just leave up the front cover as a reminder. This is available on Amazon. Thank you very much. Wishing you all the best. Goodbye.